Hello, everyone. My name is Stanley St. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Little Women, written by Louisa May Alcott. Now, before I go into summary analysis of this work, please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and/or comment so that the channel can continue to grow. Now, this work by Louisa May Alcott is very interesting. We're introduced to a family that has four daughters. The father is away at war. He's a chaplain in um, the Civil War of the United States. He's with the Union Army against the Confederates. So this is the Civil War in the United States, and the father's away at war, and the sisters and their mother Marmee, they have to stay behind and pretty much take care of the home, take care of themselves, and just keep life going. So we have Meg, who's the oldest daughter. We have Joe, who's the second oldest, followed by Beth, and then Amy, which is the baby girl, which is the baby of the family, of course. Now, the book is very interesting, and there's a lot that's going on through the book. Now, the first thing I have to say about this book is that the first part, you definitely have to keep track of the sisters. You know, most books usually have just one major character that you follow. You see his or her development. You see how that character goes about, that character functions, that character develops in their journey throughout the book. But in this book, you have to keep track of four sisters, their lives, and so the author here, Louisa May Alcott, she's going back and forth every scene. She's trying to get a word in about each daughter, what each little woman is doing, and what's different about them, what's unique about them, what to take in. We also have Hannah, who's the servant of the March household. We have Marmee, of course, who's the mother, and she's the adult that's supervising and looking after the kids. And so it's an interesting household. The girls, they absolutely love each other. These sisters absolutely love each other. Meg and Joe, they're older and they're closer in age, so they spend a lot of time together. But they each do pick a sister. You have Joe that's more comfortable with Beth, and you have Meg that's more comfortable with Amy. And so each sister has their confidant, or each sister has the other one that they're comfortable with. Again, Joe with Beth, and Meg with Amy. So Meg, let's just talk about each little women. What's interesting about each one of them? Meg is the oldest. She gets married first. She gets married to a man by the name of John. Throughout the book, she's pretty much developing. We see her developing alongside her sisters. She's a girl that she wants to be. She's not. She wants to be in a sense classy. She's very beautiful. She's charming. She pretty much becomes, in the book, we kind of see her development where she's a little girl. She grows up. She's a part of the bunch, and then later she becomes a housewife. She gets married to John. She has twins, a boy and a girl, Daisy and Demi. And so, she does get a great story. Her arc, her story is very interesting, very fascinating. We see her develop as a little girl. She explores the world, from being a little girl in a household to developing and going to balls, going to dances, starting to step out and starting to meet different people and trying to understand what life is about. Throughout the book, we get a good understanding of her character, who she is. And later, she does develop this love, this crush for John. So she's a very interesting character to get to know within this book. And of course, she is the first daughter to get married. She does not marry somebody rich. You would think throughout this book that all the daughters would marry somebody rich and wealthy and live, luxurious lives, but we get lots of lessons from Mrs. March from Marmee, excuse me. They call her Marmee. They call their mother Marmee, so I'm gonna call her Marmee here too. So they get lots of lessons from Marmee about what's important in life. It's not just about money. You have to have balance between who you love, between your children, between life, between money, between a happy home, not a house, but a happy home. And so, Marmee teaches her daughters not to just focus on money. Yes, they're poor. They're not as rich. They lost their family fortune. The father, let a friend borrow the family fortune, and so they're not as rich as they once were. And so the women at the little women at several different points within the book, they wanted to have money, but money doesn't come that easy. And so Meg, she doesn't marry a rich man. She marries John. John is, he's determined, he's hardworking, and for Margaret, for Meg, he does do all that he can. He gets a job, he gets a good paying job, he gets a small house. It's not the most glamorous house, but he gets a house that's close by to the March household, and he gets married to May, and of course they have their kids. And pretty much that's Meg's story, from her childhood, from her many different types of adventures with her sisters, from growing up to getting married quite young. These people in this time that the book was written in, people were dying in their 50s and their 60s. It's a miracle that people even saw their 60s during this time. So, pretty much everybody was pretty much married by the time you were 20. Girls just got married at the age of 18, 19, 20. You were pretty much get married. If you weren't married by 30, it would be a shocker. It would be like you're an old maid. Because technically during this time that this book was being written, or in the time period that this book is written in, if you're not married by 30, because keep in mind that it's amazing. It's a shocker if you make it to 60. It's wonderful. They throw you a party if you make it to 60. So if you make it to 30 and you're not married with children already, well, you're already half of your life gone. So the clock's ticking, and sometimes within the book, even Joe talks about this. She even says that when she's 25, she starts to think, if I make it to 30 without getting married, I'm going to be an old maid and live the rest of my life alone. And today, 30 is pretty much very, very young. And so we don't consider someone who's 30 even old at all. So it's quite interesting. And so Meg gets married at 20. She moves in with her husband, John. And the book really gives us lots of stories about Meg and her husband, and how they figure out and navigate married life, and navigate taking care of children, and navigate loneliness, and navigate love and relationship. And so her journey is quite interesting, because we do see Meg from the minute that she was a child, or a teenager, all the way up to adulthood and marriage and children and kids. And so we when you read this book, you truly feel like this is someone that and that you kind of grew up with, and during the time you're reading the book. And it's really quite interesting to see how she grows up and gets married. Now, the next daughter is Jo. She has, in the book we learn about her anger issues. Now, she's pretty much the main character of Little Women. We want, the best for Jo, her best friend, her Teddy, that she likes to call him, Lori, the boy next door, the Lawrence family, everybody. Through the minute that you pick up this book, you're already making some jokes. You know who's gonna end up together. You know who's going to be, the love story of the century. You know that Jo and Lori are gonna end up together. They're gonna go, happily ever after, have a wonderful family, enjoy each other. That the whole nine. You really know that's coming, but that doesn't happen. Really sad. Like, for me, it was a major bummer, because you're like, these are two kids, Jo and Lori, next door neighbors. It's a perfect love story. This is the Hallmark story of the year. But no, they don't get married. They don't get together. In fact, it's very prophetic when, well, I mean, pathetic is a strong word, but it is a little prophetic when Laurie finally says to Jo that he loves her in the book, and he's pretty much crying and rolling on the ground, and it's an emotional moment for both of them, where they're pretty much stabbing each other, even though they love each other dearly. It's just so tough that these two kids that did at times, showed signs of, that they were flirting, or that they were very close, or that they were very, close to one another. Times of tenderness, times of comfort, times of that's the on the borderline. The relationship between Joe and Lori, it's so close, so tender, that it's everything but a romantic relationship. And that's what's tough for a lot of readers. It's that Joe and Lori, throughout this book, they have everything that a couple would want: the closeness, the comfort, the emotional attachments. It just couldn't get there. It couldn't, cross the line of romance, which is quite saddening, because there's just so many tender moments when Joe and Lori almost got together. Tender moments when they held each other, or where Joe would lay her head on Lori's shoulder and he would hold on tight to her. It's just so tender moments, so many tender moments, where you're pretty much like, this is it, but it never happens. Joe doesn't marry Lori. Lori takes it quite hard. He actually even goes over to Europe to get over Joe, and it's really tough, really hard to read this. And this love story that doesn't happen. That if you read this book, you kind of understand, and it's hard to take it in. But Joe, yeah, no. Joe has an anger issue that she has to deal with, that her marmee, tells her how to deal with it within the book. There's a very tender moment where they talk about it, and how, even marmee, she had her own anger issues at some point. But Joe, she definitely gets lessons from her mother about how to behave and how to be a lady. Now, we have to understand, Amy and Margaret, they're more of a lady, of class and grace, and feminine grace and beauty, and the classic women of the day. But Joe is not a classic. She's not a woman of grace. She's not a woman of beauty and expertise, and how to hold the ballroom, or hold the dance, or hold polite conversation. Joe is down to earth. Joe is she's down to earth. She doesn't mind a man who can eat. She doesn't mind getting dirty. She doesn't mind not being classy. So she's not the classy woman that can keep up. Like Amy. Amy is the perfect model of grace and beauty, and upper class society. Joe is not about upper class society. She's more down in the mud. She's more down to earth, and your average woman, a woman that's there to stand by your side, a woman that's not too much worried about money and upward mobility. She just wants to be happy in someone close by her, and she's prepared to fight and defend those that she loves. So that's one thing that I love about Joe, is that she's just a person. If she's in your corner, wherever you're rich or poor, wherever you can speak proper or not, Joe's always in your corner, and she's always ready to fight for what's hers. And her story is quite interesting. At some point, it kind of seemed like she was going to end up alone in the book, but she ends up marrying the professor, Professor Bow, or Bar or Bauer. She ends up marrying the professor, and basically she has kids. He's closer to 40. That's one thing within the book. Professor Bauer is closer to 40. Barr is closer to 40, and Joe is in her mid to late 20s. So it's not a huge. It's not like a 30 you know, 30-year age gap, but it's a late 20s and late 40s. It's yeah, it's for some people it might be tough to handle. For me, you know, the professor is a little bit, is a lot older than Joe. She does marry an older man. She's in her late 20s. And for me, one thing an issue I have with this is that he's probably going to die several years before Joe. When they get married and have kids, the professor's already, pushing 40, very close into his 40s, or even at the end of the book, we can say he's firmly into his 40s, maybe. And Joe is, in her 30s by the time we can say, because they're both in their late 20s. Joe's in her late 20s. Professor Bauer's in his late 30s, close to 40. And so we can say if it's just if it's a shock or if it's quite extraordinary for people to live to 60 in this book, 60, 70, most people are probably dying in their 70s. Joe, her husband's already, closer or 40 years old. We can say, in 20 years it could be close for Joe's husband to die. I mean, that doesn't happen in the book, but because of the age gap is so wide, you could say that, when Joe's a little bit, or in her 40s or in her mid 40s, she could probably lose her husband. The book doesn't address that. It's not a big issue, but for me, that's one thing issue I have with people that have massive age gap in marriage. It's just that it's quite evident that there could be a death and that you could be alone once again, and possibly alone in the world, and you have to figure out the world on your own again. So that's a problem for Joe. That's kind of it's you're happy that she finds, her professor, and she gets married in the book, and she falls in love, she has children, but it's a lot to take in, because you kind of understand that the man could die at some point in the future, when Joe is still, probably in her 40s, or um, yeah, in her mid 40s, yeah. So Beth is the next sister. Beth, she dies within the book. Let's just get right to the point. She loved music, loved to play the piano, but she gets scarlet fever from a baby. She was very charitable, loved kids, loved other people, loved to be nice to other people. But yeah, she gets scarlet fever. She at first she fights it off, but later she dies. And it's quite sad. She was the gentle, quiet girl, part of the pack. And you kind of saw from the beginning of the story that, her demise was going to come. She wasn't like the other girls worrying about looks and beauty and pretty and husbands. And, she even says this herself. She never had desires of where she was going to be in the world, or her position in the world, or her placement in the world. She just basically was, enjoying the natural, birds and nature and music and all these types of things. And then, she gets scarlet fever, and yeah, did she first fights it off, and then later she just dies. So that's very sad for the family, and the family had to deal with that. But yeah, that's Beth. Beth has a tragic ending. The last little woman is Amy. Amy is the beauty of the family. She's graceful, beautiful, elegant, tall, and just she goes to Europe within the novel. She goes to Europe. She goes all over Europe, sees different places, flirts. She started to date Fred, this guy that she was interested in for a while, but she doesn't end up marrying him. She ends up marrying Lori. After Lori tells Joe that he was madly in love with her, Joe is like, "No, I can't marry you. I don't love you in that way." And it's a very sad and thing, because Lori's like, one day he just tells Joe on a walk, "I love you, I want to marry you, let's get married." This is after he graduates college and everything, and Joe's like, "No, you're my brother." And Joe's like, Joe and Lori, they're pretty much just wallowing and crying, and all these types of things. It's very sad, very pitiful. I mean, the way that Lori pretty much begs Joe to marry him, and Joe's like, "No, I don't want to marry you." And he escapes to Europe to get over Joe, and then that's where in Europe he crosses paths with Amy. They start talking, and they start, there's like one scene where they're both in um they're both out together in this garden. They're they're together, and they basically tell each other's, worst faults, and how, Laurie's kind of lazy and not, he dawdles around, and Meg, and I'm sorry, not Meg, Amy tells him that you dawdle, and this is, Joe doesn't like men who dawdle. You're wasting your life. You have all this money, you have all this ability to do whatever you want, and you're just dawdling. This is what Amy tells Laurie in this moment of truth, and Laurie in his own way tells Amy, you're trying to marry Fred for money, and this, pretty much, tackles and hurts Amy where it truly hurts her heart, her mind, her pride, and she kind of like understands that. She was trying to find the richest man that she could to marry for money, because she just doesn't want to be poor. Joe's okay with being poor. Meg is, okay with being average, middle class, but Amy did not want to be poor. She wanted to be filthy rich. And the truth of that stings when Laurie, in his own way, not directly, but in his own way, tells, Amy that, you're just trying to get rich, trying to marry someone rich so you could live the good life. And, well, ultimately, she does marry someone rich. She marries Laurie. But Fred was much richer than Laurie, but still, that's the truth that Amy needed to hear. They do get married. They actually both recognize their love for each other on a boat while they're paddling the boat. So that's very cute. And then they do get married. They come back and they pretty much tell the family that they're married. Very long book. Lots of things are happening, but ultimately in Europe, Amy, very beautiful, very wonderful woman to have, very artistic. She's a great artist. And Laurie becomes a businessman. He works hard, supports his wife. And yeah, and Amy and Laurie end up together, and they're a good match. Laurie's a little bit older, a couple years older than Amy, and I think it matches. I think in many ways in relationships, this is not universal. This is not for everybody, but usually I think it's better for the man to be, somewhat older than the woman. It doesn't always have to be the case. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the woman being older. It's just that sometimes, especially, a man's role is to lead. A man's role since the dawn of time was always to lead his household, to lead his family. And for a woman to submit and to allow a man to be her leader, it has to be a man who, first of all, can be a man of justice, who's able to listen, hear his wife, not just be a brute, but hear his wife, consider all of her opinions and all her wishes, and do her best to please her, to be there for her, and to do things right. If a man can be a good leader, of course his wife will follow him to the ends of the earth. But if he's not a good leader, then he can't lead a household into prosperity and good fortunes. And that's why I personally believe, from my analysis, it's always good for the husband to be a couple years older, so that he can be more wise and mature, to be a good head of the household, to be a good counselor, and just to see what's good to do in certain situations. And so that's why I could say that it wasn't good for Laurie and Joe to end up together, because they're both they're very similar to one another, and they're the same age, and so that wouldn't work out. And Laurie couldn't be with Meg because Meg's older than him, and Meg's looking for someone with more maturity, and Meg couldn't wait for Laurie to grow up. Um, so it's great that Laurie ended up with Amy. It just works. And so the book, it takes us through the lives of of these four women. Laurie was another member of the group. He's not, of course, he's not one of the Little Women, but Laurie was a member of the group. He was all alone, and the Little Women, these sisters, they brought him into the group, into the March family. Well, first as a friend, as one of the gang, as a member of the gang, but later he actually becomes a part of the March family by marrying Amy. So that's quite wonderful. Um, so there's some other major characters. Just a little bit more about Laurie. He's filthy rich. Well, he's very rich. His grandfather made a lot of money. And so he dawdles, he gets into mischief. When you have a lot of money and you don't have to work hard to make something out of yourself in the world, and you're a rich kid, you're born rich, you live rich, you eat rich, you do rich, you dawdle, you live off the cuff because you already have all the money that you could ever need. So why work hard? Why be a man that gets up at 4 a.m. in the morning, or why work yourself to the bone when you already have it all? So that's why I think Laurie dawdled, is because, well, his inheritance is a good inheritance, and he could do whatever he wants. So yeah, too much money can make us lazy and dawdle, and not worth anything. But Laurie fixes that. He puts himself into good shape, even though he had a lot of money, and he became somebody respectable. So yeah, that's Laurie. Throughout their childhood, if we talk about the kids' childhood, their childhood was filled with adventures, games, contests, parties. Throughout the book, it's a lot. I mean, we see the kids pretty much grow up from when they were, teenagers, young girls, and Laurie, a young boy. They grow up, they gain skills, they develop their identities. Amy wanted to be an artist. She wanted to create and draw. She doesn't ultimately do that. But that's one thing she wanted to do with her life. Joe became a writer. Meg became a wife and mother. Beth sadly died, and yeah. So we see the kids grow up. We see the little women grow up, to being women and being married and having children. Aunt March is a rich member of the family. She left her house to Joe, and Joe turned it into a school, which is not nothing that Aunt March would ever want, because Aunt March was an old relic of the past that wanted class and prestige, and the rich to stay rich, and the rich to marry the rich. That's why she got into a big fight with Meg when Meg decided to marry John, who was just an average man. But Aunt March died, and she left her house to Joe, and Joe turned it into a school where a bunch of boys play on the grounds and mess it up. So that's quite interesting, quite funny. So the story ends with Meg and John, they're at their house, and they're close by, and Lori and the Lawrence household, and Amy, she's a part of the Lawrence household, and Joe, with at Aunt March house with her husband, the professor, and their kids. And they have, like, apple picking time seasons, and all types of games where they're all together, and they're rejoicing. There's a little sad part at the end of the story where we learned that Lori and Amy, they do have a child, a baby girl, Elizabeth, in honor of Beth, and Elizabeth Lori. But she's a little bit, sickly. So that's a little sad thing that we get to know at the end of the book, at the end of the books. But that's the thing about life. That's one thing that this book tells us, that life is not perfect. That you get the good and the bad. So there's a lot of things that ended up well for these girls and their families. At the same time, there are things on the horizon that are very dark. For example, again, Professor Bowers is a good amount older than Joe. So at any time he could die first, and she's all alone again. We have Lori and Amy. They have a baby girl that's or a little girl that's not 100% healthy. And Well, Meg and John. I mean, they're, they're okay. They don't have that a dark thing or anything that I'm concerned about that's in my attention. Meg pretty much just she had an average life, but which is an average life is not a horrible thing. having a wonderful husband, a wonderful set of kids, and a loving home. Well, I would say, what? Let me rephrase that. I think she had a wonderful life, a family, a warm house, loving house. That's something that all humans have always tried to reach and aspire towards. Um, yeah, that's the book. In terms of deeper meaning, in terms of analysis, I think that this book, tells you the story of family, tells you the story of love, tells you the story of how sometimes, family members can pretty much use each other to better themselves, to change minds. I think Amy is becomes more of a human being at the end of the book. Because at first, when she was young, she just wanted to look beautiful, be rich, be around the rich, marry for money. But at the end, she gains a heart and morals and ethics, and she cares about love and being happy, and not just being an artist and famous and money. She actually becomes a more of a human being, and loving her husband and her family. Joe is down to earth. She knew what she wanted. She wanted Professor Bow, a Bower or Bar. She didn't want to marry Laurie. That probably would have been a disaster. And Laurie even admits this later in the novel. Yes, they had some flirtation here and there. Yes, there's a point where Joe probably would have accepted when she was really lonely. There's a point that she probably would have accepted Laurie's proposal, but it would have ended in disaster. So it's great that they didn't get married. And Meg learned a lot of lessons, all the lessons that Marmee told her when she was a little girl. It came through fruition within the novel, where she learned how to use them in her marriage. And so we see a lot of the lessons that the girls learned when they were kids being applied to them as adults, and how it helped them develop into be good wives, good mothers, good professional women, who can manage businesses. So Joe, she's managing a business. Amy, she's, with her husband, thinking about, good charity and helping people. And Meg, knowing how to manage a household, and being a good wife. There's a lot of lessons here to learn and to understand. And also, what they all learn with Beth's death, and how, not everything ends up in a happy ending. So that's one thing about the story. Not everybody gets a happy ending. What happened to Beth was very tragic. So Little Women is very down to earth. It teaches you a lot about life, and so that's quite interesting that we get this from this book. Some people believe that Little Women is a feminist book. Personally, I do not see it. I don't see the feminism in this book. Um, it's not like the girls were being held back in any way, shape, or form. Um, all the girls, they grow up, they get married, and they have children, and they're all mothers, and they're all. I don't see the feminism in this book. It's all about. I mean, yeah, they're really. I mean, some people believe that this book is a feminist book. That there's some talk about equality or things like that, but this book has nothing to do with equality or things like that. It's really just the story of a family, and these girls that are being developed within this family. So I don't see it. Maybe some other people see it, but if people do see feminism in this book, let me know in the comments, and I'll argue with them, because I don't see it. I mean, I need some evidence to say that this book has some feminism in it. But I don't see feminism in this book. Because it's not talking about women's rights or equality or anything like that. It's really just a bunch of girls that are finding their place in the world, and their identity, and what it means to have family or to create a family. So I don't see the feminism in this book. Um, but other than that, really great book. We get these four wonderful girls. Their mother and father, Aunt March, Hannah, their servant. Mr. Lawrence. The old man, Laurie's grandfather. Really great characters. I mean, in this book, you get a whole score of characters and their parts in this book. But I just wanted to let you guys know what happened in this book, what happened to these little women, what they did with their lives, the core focus of the novel, and what happened within it. But really interesting novel. That's all I had to say about it. Please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and or comment so that the channel can continue to grow.